In a little Arkansas church, Bob Joyce urged, "Never reveal this." He stood in front of a congregation that had come to hear him speak, but stayed to hear him finally answer the question that had followed him for decades, his voice wavering a little. Pastor Bob Joyce, 71, has lived under a false identity and denied being Elvis Presley for the majority of his adult life. He has adamantly maintained that he is simply Bob Joyce, a devout man with a voice that eerily resembles that of the rock and roll king. However, something has changed in the last few months. Bob has begun discussing topics he was instructed not to bring up. Accounts of Elvis Presley's actual life after August 16, 1977, and the reasons why so many people were drawn to the world of Presley wanted those tales to be forgotten. He hasn't acknowledged being Elvis. Although he has not stated that he staged his death, he has started to discuss the potential that the official account of Elvis Presley's last days was sanitized, incomplete, and meticulously manipulated by those with an interest in concealing the whole truth. Who is Bob Joyce, then? Why do multitudes think he is a disguised Elvis Presley? What is the secret of what actually occurred to the king that Bob was instructed not to share? On January 21, 1953, Robert Dowdy Joyce was born in Benton, Arkansas, a small town located roughly 30 miles southwest of Little Rock. The date and place of his birth were verified by Saline County birth records, which identified his parents as local working-class citizens. Most aspects of his boyhood were uneventful, at least based on the limited records that date back to that time period. He was raised in a devout home where attending church was an integral part of daily life rather than merely a Sunday duty. Bob first fell in love with music while attending a tiny Baptist congregation with his family. Bob began singing in church choruses when he was 8 or 9 years old. His voice was already displaying the clarity and force that would eventually cause others to pause and pay attention. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, rock and roll, gospel, and country music were all major influences on his guitar style, which he developed after learning from family members and church musicians. Bob was just one of several young musicians at the time who were greatly influenced by Elvis Presley. He learned to sing with the same passion that made Elvis famous by listening to his songs and studying his phrasing. Bob Joyce was leading a tranquil life in Arkansas during the 1970s, while Elvis Presley was playing sold-out shows in Las Vegas, battling prescription drug addiction, and witnessing his health decline year by year. To make ends meet, he worked a variety of jobs, everything from industrial labor to construction, while pursuing music as a hobby rather than a profession. He performed at neighborhood gatherings and local churches, gradually establishing himself as a gifted vocalist with a voice that was reminiscent of a renowned person. Bob would shrug off jokes made by friends and relatives that he sounded like Elvis. Many folks have Elvis-like voices. Bob was only one of hundreds of singers who had adopted the King's style and turned it into their own. The monarch had impacted an entire generation of vocalists. Nothing about it was out of the ordinary. Nothing that would indicate Bob was anything more than a gifted amateur musician from small-town Arkansas. Bob had a calling to ministry in his late 20s. After studying theology and attending Bible college, he was ordained as a Baptist minister. His earliest pastoral roles were in small rural churches with a congregation of 20 to 30 individuals on a typical Sunday. Like thousands other rural pastors across America, he led worship, spoke, performed marriages and burials, and enjoyed a simple, service-oriented existence. His meager pay was frequently augmented by side jobs or assistance from his wife, a teacher. After getting married and starting a family, Bob brought up his kids in parsonages and church fellowship halls. His family, his faith, and his church were the center of his existence. He had no desire for wealth or notoriety. He had no intention of becoming a televangelist or constructing a large congregation. He was happy to lead worship using his musical talents, serve small communities, and spend a life focused on mission rather than fame. Bob Joyce served as a pastor in Arkansas and occasionally in nearby states during the 1980s and 1990s. Although it was always a local following, he gained a following among those who valued his musical skills and preaching manner. On Sunday mornings, people traveled from neighboring villages to hear him. Bob Joyce was a preacher, a musician, and a family man who was committed to serving God. There was no hint that he was anything more. And then there was the internet. Videos of Bob Joyce singing gospel music at church began to surface on YouTube at some point in the early 2000s. Members of the congregation who wanted to share their pastor's lovely voice with friends frequently used low-quality cameras to record the straightforward recordings. and relatives. However, there was an oddity when those movies began to circulate outside of Bob's immediate neighborhood. Bob's voice was more than just Elvis. He had an Elvis-like voice. The melody's tone, phrasing, vibrato, and the way he held specific notes and added delicate flourishes. Anyone who has ever listened to Elvis Presley would find it all uncannily familiar. The number of comments exploded. People began examining the vocal similarities between Bob's performances and Elvis records, frame by frame. Then someone saw the physical similarity. Bob's jawline was identical, the same overall build and eye shape as Elvis in his final years. If you imagined Elvis had continued to age after 1977, then it made sense that he wore glasses and had graying hair. Additionally, there was a striking resemblance to Elvis Presley in his vocal techniques, hand gestures, head tilt, and subtle facial emotions. The conspiracy theory spread swiftly. The goal of entire websites and YouTube channels was to demonstrate that Bob Joyce was actually Elvis Presley disguised as someone else. Using audio software, people examined voice patterns and claimed that the vocal signatures matched. By examining photos, they made side-by-side comparisons that emphasized all of the similarities. They looked into Bob's past, searching for any gaps in his records that would provide an explanation for Elvis's decades-long hiding place. The hypothesis went in this manner. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley staged his own death because he was worn out from his celebrity, drowning in debt, and possibly threatened by organized crime leaders with whom he had ties. He employed a body duplicate in the coffin, created the scene at Graceland with the assistance of a few close friends, and vanished into a new life as Bob Joyce, a modest minister in Arkansas where no one would think to search for the rock and roll king. Believers cited purported proof, such as the unusually heavy weight of Elvis Presley's casket, which suggested it might have held anything other than a person. The peculiarities in the official autopsy report, which had contradictions that made it unclear if the body under examination belonged to Elvis. The fact that he was buried less than 2 days after his death, which some said was unusually quick, and the fact that over the years, a number of Elvis's close associates had intimated that the official account was incomplete. Bob Joyce has continuously denied that he is Elvis Presley. He has stated in interviews and public remarks that he is merely a pastor who happens to sound like Elvis, that the similarity is accidental, and that people are perceiving patterns that are not real. He has voiced his displeasure with the persistent inquiries, the violation of his privacy, and the way his ministry has been overshadowed by conspiracy theories. However, the speculation has continued despite denials. They have really fueled it. Of course, Bob would deny being Elvis, according to believers. The whole point of pretending to be dead would be undermined if he came clean. They contend that the denials are necessary performance to keep up the illusion and are a component of the cover tale. Then Bob began making statements that caused others to question whether there could be more to the story than he had been willing to acknowledge. Over the past few years, Bob has mentioned secrets, burdens he has carried, and facts that others have advised him to keep hidden in his lectures. He has discussed how the world frequently adopts sanitized accounts of history without considering what might have been omitted. Additionally, he has subtly and cautiously alluded to the possibility that the official account of Elvis Presley's passing may not properly convey the intricacy of what actually transpired. Bob discussed repentance and second chances in a sermon that went viral online. According to him, God occasionally provides people the chance to start over, to put the stresses and faults of the past behind them and create a new life centered around faith and service. He discussed how money can be a burden, how fame can be a prison, and how sometimes the only way to find calm is to vanish from the world that knows your name. This was seen as confirmation by many who think Bob is Elvis. It was interpreted as a serious analysis of biblical topics by those who believe he is merely a pastor. In any case, the sermon fanned the flames. Bob Joyce was not the first to propose the opinion that Elvis Presley staged his death. Since 1977, it has existed in a variety of forms, with each version highlighting distinct goals and strategies. To understand why Bob Joyce became such a focal point for Christians, one must comprehend these theories. Some iterations concentrate on financial issues. Despite making large sums of money during his career, Elvis was reputedly in debt to the tune of millions of dollars at the time of his death. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, had made financial mistakes that left the king with less money than anyone knew, and had negotiated deals that greatly favored himself over Elvis, collecting 50% of Elvis's earnings. Elvis owing the IRS a sizable amount in delinquent taxes. He had extravagant habits, such as his propensity to make impulsive purchases of homes, vehicles, and jewels and then give them away to strangers, friends, and family. And he was providing financial support to a sizable group of individuals who were dependent on him. There was a lot of financial strain, and some experts think that Elvis was able to avoid his responsibilities by pretending to be dead. If he was lawfully, his debts would become an issue for the estate after his death. He could start afresh with whatever money he had managed to stave off before his purported death, and he would no longer have to provide for dozens of people. Threats from organized crime were highlighted in other iterations of the idea. Elvis had been involved with law enforcement since the early 1970s. Despite his own drug usage, he took his honorary DA badge seriously after meeting with President Richard Nixon in 1970. Elvis allegedly provided intelligence regarding drug trafficking and mob activities that he learnt about through his contacts in the entertainment sector, assisting the FBI in their investigations against organized criminal leaders. Elvis became a target because of those links, according to some conspiracy theories. They bring up the fact that a number of individuals associated with Elvis passed away under questionable conditions in the years after his passing. They make reference to claims that Elvis was warned by others not to participate in specific economic transactions, or else he would suffer repercussions. Additionally, they imply that the only way to save himself and his family from reprisals from those who perceived him as a danger or liability was to stage his death. Stories about Elvis's affiliation with the Fraternal Order of Police and other law enforcement groups are also available. Elvis gathered honorary titles and badges from police agencies all around the nation. Additionally, some Christians contend that Jesus had access to resources through these ties that might have enabled him to stage his demise. Policemen with the ability to fabricate paperwork, coroners with the ability to falsify autopsy reports, officials from the government who could make a new identity with a birth certificate, social security number, and background checks. The notion seems unrealistic unless you take into account Elvis's true level of influence and authority. He was among the most well-known individuals in the world in 1977. His faithful associates would have done nearly anything for him if he asked, and he had connections with law enforcement, politicians, and influential people in the entertainment world. However, there are alternative versions that emphasize burnout and tiredness, which may be the most psychologically plausible. Even though he was in grave physical condition, Elvis was performing non-stop in the months prior to his death. He had high blood pressure, glaucoma, an enlarged colon, liver disease, and an addiction to prescription drugs. He was also overweight. George Nicopolis, his physician, was giving him large doses of medications to keep him going, help him sleep, wake him up, control his moods, and manage his pain. Elvis was actually dying because he was caught in a vicious cycle. To sustain his entourage and pay his debts, he had to perform. However, using medications was necessary for him to function, and the drugs were ruining his body. He knew that. In his last months, friends who paid him a visit recalled a man who appeared to be very depressed, who talked about how tired he was of the pressures, and who said he wanted to just go away and live a normal life away from the spotlight. According to this opinion, Elvis took the logical choice to pretend to be dead rather than pass away slowly on stage. He made the decision to arrange his demise, vanish, and begin anew as the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley could be lifted by someone else. Then, the question arises, is it possible for someone as well-known as Elvis to pull off such a trick? What would his new life be like if he did? He would have to make the decision to live a life that was as dissimilar from his former one as possible. He refused to go back to Memphis, Las Vegas, or any other location where he might be recognized, perform on large stages, or pursue fame or wealth. He would have to transform into an entirely unremarkable person, who would never get the kind of attention that could reveal his identity. That description nearly exactly describes a pastor in rural Arkansas. Rather than being famous, it is a life of service. It allows you to stay in touch with music without performing on national platforms. Without exposing you to millions of individuals, it provides you with a community. Additionally, it gives you a good excuse to avoid the spotlight while maintaining a public presence in small, controlled settings where people recognize you as Bob Joyce rather than as a mystery or a superstar. Although the official narrative is simple, more research should be done on the specifics of August 16, 1977. Elvis was supposed to take a plane to Portland, Maine that morning to start a new performance tour. His inability to fall asleep had kept him awake for the whole of the night, a routine that had become typical in his last months. He was at Graceland with his girlfriend, Ginger Alden. She further claims that Elvis disappeared into the bathroom at around 9 in the morning. Ginger awoke at approximately 1:30 and she discovered Elvis unconscious on the lavatory floor in the afternoon. His body was already exhibiting symptoms of rigor mortis, and he was lying face down on the thick crimson carpet with his gold pajama bottoms still on. Within minutes after her phoning for assistance, Graceland was in disarray. Al Strada, Elvis's personal assistant, and Joe Esposito, his road manager, attempted to revive him. Elvis was taken to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis after an ambulance was summoned. For over 30 minutes, the medical staff at Baptist Memorial worked on Elvis, trying CPR, giving him medication, and doing everything they could to restart his heart. However, it was too late. At 3:30 p.m., Elvis Aaron Presley was declared deceased. Central Time. His age was 42. Cardiac arrhythmia, which is basically a deadly irregularity in the heart's rhythm, was the certified cause of death. However, the autopsy performed by Shelby County Medical Examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco showed a body that had been destroyed by years of abusing prescription drugs. Codeine, Valium, morphine, and a number of other drugs were found in considerable amounts in Elvis's system. He had a bloated and impacted colon, which had probably been causing him a lot of agony for months. His heart was enlarged, a disease known as cardiomegaly that is frequently linked to long-term drug use, and his liver displayed symptoms of damage. Dr. Francisco declared the death to be natural, blaming heart illness instead of a narcotics overdose. Since then, that choice has generated controversy. According to medical professionals who have examined the autopsy results, Elvis's death was primarily caused by the enormous amounts of drugs in his system, and calling it natural was a ploy to preserve Elvis's good name and shield the doctors who had been giving him those prescriptions for years from legal issues. Only 2 days after Elvis's passing, on August 18th, the funeral took place. It was a spectacle for the media. The streets around Graceland were crowded with thousands of fans, many of whom were crying in public. Live coverage is provided by television crews from all over the world. Additionally, a special service was performed within Graceland for family and close friends prior to Elvis's interment at Forest Hill Cemetery. Conspiracy theorists, however, point out irregularities in that narrative that have never been properly explained. Elvis Presley's gravestone misspells his middle name. According to Elvis' birth certificate, his parents spelled his middle name Aaron to correspond with his stillborn twin brother, Jesse Guerin. However, the customary spelling of Aaron appeared on the original gravestone in Forest Hill Cemetery. Although the flaw has since been fixed, proponents of the staged death idea contend that it implies the tombstone was hurriedly made without adequate inspection, perhaps because Elvis was not the person buried beneath it. Questions have also been raised about how Elvis Presley's father, Vernon Presley, behaved during the funeral. According to several witnesses, Vernon stated that the body in the coffin did not appear to be his son. According to other reports, Vernon claimed that the person in the coffin was too waxy, too pale, and too different from Elvis Presley's appearance even in death. Proponents contend that Vernon was aware of the reality, that Elvis was not the body in the coffin, and that his reaction to witnessing the deceit was one of sincere shock. Additionally, funeral home employees have reported that the body did not appear normal. When preparing the corpse for burial, one mortician apparently complained that it felt off and was too heavy. Another asserted that some physical traits did not correspond with Elvis's recognized features. However, these claims have been contested and cannot be independently confirmed. There are concerns about the burial's actual speed. Less than 48 hours after his death on August 16th, Elvis was laid to rest on August 18th. Rapid burial does reduce the possibility for a careful study of the body, but it is typical when the deceased is a public person and the family want to avoid protracted media attention. There wasn't much time for family members who weren't at Graceland right away to fly to Memphis and see the body before it was buried. The peculiar case of the coffin is another. Elvis was interred within a concrete vault in a sealed, 900-pound copper casket. There has been conjecture that the casket may have held something other than a human body due to its weight alone. Supporters point out that Elvis's body wouldn't need such a massive coffin, even if his weight at the time of death were taken into consideration. According to them, the coffin may have been weighted to give the impression that a body was inside. Elvis himself vanished to begin a new life, but none of these theories have ever received formal support from Bob Joyce. He has never claimed that Elvis staged his demise. He has never asserted that he knows the truth about what actually transpired at Graceland. However, he has started talking more candidly about the notion that influential people frequently shape narratives, that official accounts occasionally omit uncomfortable facts, and that the public isn't always given a whole picture of what happens to well-known people when they pass away. For the first time in years, Bob directly addressed the rumors in a recent video that was captured at a church service and subsequently uploaded online. He said that he has been told not to discuss specific topics, to confirm or refute particular theories, or to participate in identification speculation. He claimed that those cautions were issued by persons who were worried about preserving their reputations, averting legal action, and preserving the delicate equilibrium that conceals some stories. However, Bob then made a statement that attracted everyone's interest. No matter how long people try to stifle the truth, it will eventually come to light, he said. According to him, Elvis Presley's story did not finish as the headline suggested, and there are those who know exactly what happened but have opted to remain silent out of loyalty, fear, or legal responsibility. He refrained from claiming to be Elvis. He did not assert that he had proof that Elvis had staged his demise. However, the confidence and precision with which he talked left many questioning his level of expertise. It is not as unlikely as it may seem that Elvis may have had assistance in staging his demise. Elvis had resources, relationships, and a network of ardently devoted followers. Dr. George Nicopolis, his personal doctor, had access to potentially manipulable medical data and paperwork. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, had a track record of controlling information and breaking the law. Additionally, Memphis Mafia members had demonstrated throughout the years that they would stop at nothing to keep Elvis safe. Elvis would have required a new identity, a place to go where no one would recognize him, and a compelling enough story to justify his decision to start over if he had desired to vanish. The life of Bob Joyce nearly completely fits that description. A peaceful life in rural Arkansas, an emphasis on ministry and spirituality that would clarify why he never wanted wealth or notoriety, and a voice and appearance that resembled Elvis just enough to make people wonder, but not so much that it would be obvious to anyone. Documentation is the theory's largest barrier. Prior to Elvis Presley's passing, Bob Joyce had a known past. Records of his 1953 birth, pictures of him as a young man, and accounts of those who knew him before to his purported death are all available. Believers contend that either Bob Joyce, the pastor, is not the same person as Bob Joyce on the birth certificate, or those papers may have been falsified. However, such necessitates a degree of cooperation and conspiracy that is more difficult to maintain under scrutiny. As is frequently the case, the truth, conspiracy theories most likely fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Bob Joyce most likely isn't Elvis Presley assuming a different persona. That situation is extremely implausible due to the logistical difficulties, the large number of participants, and the absence of reliable evidence. Bob Joyce may, however, have more information regarding Elvis's last days than he has disclosed in public. He might be connected to several of Elvis's close associates. He might be using his position to allude to facts that he is unable or unable to express directly, and he might have heard things that were never intended to be shared in private chats. Bob Joyce, who is 71 years old, is at a stage in life where legacy begins to take precedence over privacy. Now would be a good time for him to share any knowledge he may have about Elvis that the public is unaware of, and it appears that he might be getting ready to speak more given his recent readiness to discuss the subject, even in ambiguous and carefully worded ways. The statement "never revealed this" carries weight implies that Bob was advised to keep quiet by someone. The fact that Bob is now speaking implies that he has determined the time for silence is gone, regardless of whether that person was a friend, relative, legal counsel, or someone associated with the Presley estate. Bob has recently recast the problem as one of whether people are willing to accept that official narratives are not always full, rather than if Elvis is still alive. He has implied that the Presley family, the estate managers, and other parties with financial and legal stakes in upholding the official narrative had justifications for withholding some information. He has also implied that those facts could alter how people view Elvis's last years, his mental health, and his decisions. Additionally, Bob has discussed redemption in ways that seem intimate. He discusses how everyone should be given another chance, how celebrity and wealth are not worth sacrificing your soul, and how sometimes the most courageous thing to do is to leave all that the world holds dear in order to find contentment and meaning in life. It is unclear whether he is talking about himself, Elvis, or some combination of the two. Elvis Presley and Bob Joyce's conspiracy hypothesis isn't going away. People will believe Bob as long as he looks like Elvis, sounds like Elvis, and speaks in a way that maintains the mystery. The hypothesis will continue to gain traction as long as there remain unresolved issues regarding Elvis Presley's passing, discrepancies in the official record, and those who assert that they know more than they actually do. However, the reality may be not as significant as what the theory stands for. A deep part of the human psyche is touched by the notion that Elvis could have left the spotlight and opted for a tranquil life of service rather than the turmoil of celebrity. We want to think that individuals can evolve, that legends can break free from their own myths, and that even those who appear stuck by their own success can be given another chance. Bob Joyce has come to represent that potential, whether he is Elvis Presley or merely a man who sounds like him. He stands for the optimism that there is more to the story, that the official version is incomplete, and that sometimes the most important secrets are those that are obvious. They warned him not to tell anyone about this, as Bob has stated. However, the truth tends to come to the surface. Millions of people want to accept the story Bob Joyce is delivering through sermons, songs, and well-chosen words, regardless of whether he is the guardian of Elvis Presley's greatest secret or just a loyal fan who happens to share his voice. Because perhaps anyone can achieve atonement and peace after a lifetime of fame and hardship if Elvis Presley's tale can be changed. What do you believe Bob Joyce actually knows about Elvis Presley's fate? What facts might be concealed if the official account of Elvis Presley's passing isn't complete? Tell us what you think. Additionally, if this mystery caused you to reevaluate all of your preconceived notions about the rock and roll king, be sure to subscribe for more undiscovered stories. Storylines that go against what we've always taken for granted.